Well, I think that the true story here is the economic growth miracle of the Asia Pacific in general, and India and China in particular. The reality is that there's a significant amount of listings that have come out of China. There is a lot of choice for investors out of China to participate in that domestic growth story. And right now, there's very few choices from India that allow retail investors from the U.S. to participate in that growth story. And so I think that's one of the reasons that Make My Trip has been such a tremendous success. I also believe that anything related to the economic growth story here in India, in particular, the growth of the middle class, the growth of the consumer spending power, is something that will be attractive to U.S. investors going forward. Well, I certainly think that this is obviously a little bit higher on the risk spectrum in terms of the average investor. But the reality is if you're seeking growth, you've got to seek growth outside the U.S. for the most part right now. You can still find innovation in the U.S. and certain innovative growth companies from the U.S., for example, like a Tesla Motors, which listed earlier this year. However, the bulk of the true consumer growth stories, and I would say the near to midterm growth stories, are going to come from the most active and dynamic economies in the world, which are out here in the Asia Pacific. I'd say it's a good mix of the two. The United States market is somewhat unique in that it's over 90% institutional investor driven. Now, that can be a bit skewed because you're actually including all the mutual funds and so forth, right? Those are considered to be institutional investors, although in many cases they represent the retail investor. So I would say that in the case of most of these companies, when they initially go out, they're predominantly targeting the institutional investors when they build their books, and then to a lesser extent the retail investor. But I think for long-term interest, you need to have a mixture of both. Companies that have strong fundamentals but don't communicate their stories effectively are not going to maximize their valuation. Right. Companies that have a great communication or a great story but don't have the fundamentals to back it up are also not going to maximize their valuation. Now, I realize this is a very basic thing to say. This is not rocket science that I'm talking about here. But you'd be surprised at how many entrepreneurs, I don't think as much here in India, but in particular in other parts of Asia, do not realize this fundamental fact. They need to communicate better, and they need to have a strong investor relations component to their business. It's extremely important, and it's an area of their business that is worth the investment. Obviously, in India, you already have, I believe, fairly stringent corporate governance rules. You have fairly stringent disclosure rules. And in addition, obviously, in India is in addition to the local languages, an English-speaking country, or an English-fluent country, if you will. And so I think that the communication level and the ability to communicate with foreign investors is a bit stronger here than it is in other parts of Asia, where English is not a primary or a secondary language. The other factor that I think works in India's favor is the amazing amount of education, in particular overseas education, that many of the CEOs, CFOs, and entrepreneurs have gained by studying overseas or even here domestically at the finer universities here. And so they've gained that international experience, that international knowledge, and in many cases have brought that back to India and are working here to build the Indian economy. Something that I think is a very positive thing. I think that there's perhaps a bit of a sense in the U.S., and maybe this is just me because I follow it a little bit more closely, that there is not as stringent enforcement of rules violations, and that there are exceptions made for certain people when it should be black and white across the board. That, I would say, to me is the biggest issue of perception